should be from this position to, oh, it stayed.
Hello you dirty potters, how are you today? Today we're going to talk about how to fire an electric model 181 Skutt kiln. Now if you're here trying to figure out how to bisque your kiln, this is the wrong video. I've already made a video on that and I'll link that down below for you. But if you've already watched that video and you're trying to figure out the next step, well, this is for you. Now this is my manual 181 Skutt kiln. His name is Ghost. Ghost here is an electric oxidation kiln. That means all the recipes and glazes that I'm going to put inside of him are going to be formulated specifically for oxidation firing. And luckily for me, I have an entire shelf of glazeware ready to go inside this kiln. But before we get started on how to load this thing and fire it off, there's a couple things you're actually going to need before you start to play with the insides. The first thing you're going to need are some kiln shelves, i.e. kiln furniture. The second thing you're going to need are some kiln stilts. And the last thing you're going to need are some parametric cone sitters and or bars. This right here is Cone 6 and their Orton brand. I trust Orton brand. They work for me in the past, they work for me in the future, and they work for me in the present. I love these things. Inside these boxes are these little tiny cone shaped things, and these melt at a very specific temperature. That temperature is the temperature you're going to be firing your pottery off at. The reason you need these for a manual kiln especially is because these are going to sit in a little tiny spot inside your kiln, and they're going to melt at the proper temperature in which your kiln needs to turn off. Especially if you don't have a fancy kiln with all the numbers and the buttons on the side. Oh, I paid extra money for my kiln, oh. Now this right here is a kiln shelf. You're going to end up putting these inside your kiln, and your pottery is going to end up sitting right on top of them like this. But your kiln stacks upwards like the high majority of kilns do. So you're not going to put one plate in there and call it a day. You're going to end up putting multiple plates and shelves on top of each other. So when this is inside of your kiln, you're going to end up having pottery on your shelf just like this. You're going to end up putting these kiln stilts on here just like this, like a little trifecta of doom. Then you're going to put another layer on top of it just like this. And this is going to allow you to put a secondary or even third layer of pottery inside of your kiln. But keep in mind you're going to need a variety of these kiln stilts right here because there's a bunch of different sizes for these things in the first place. If I'm loading an entire shelf of these teacups right here, these stilts should do just fine because they're a little tiny bit taller than this cup right here. But if I got these tiny ones right here, these are a little bit smaller than the very tippy top of this, and I won't be able to place another shelf on top without hitting the very top of this right here. And vice versa if you have a plate or something like this. This plate is clearly smaller than this stilt right here. And by getting these little tiny stilts, whenever I put a shelf on top, I could simply build another layer. But if I get these big stilts right here, yeah, sure, I might fill up that layer, but I'm also wasting a massive amount of space right here when I only need this much clearance. So I could be putting a lot more pottery right here in this space, and it's just an inefficient way to load your kiln. You're wasting space, energy, and your own time. So once you have your kiln, you have your stilts here, you have your cone sitters and or parametric bars and or cones, and you have a couple shelves on you, it's time to load your kiln. You see this thing right here? This thing is what tripped the kiln to go offwards. And your goal is to make sure that this stays down so that the kiln stays on the entire time while it's firing off. Once this thing goes up, the kiln will trip off like this and it will turn the power to your kiln off. But how do I do that? I hear you asking through the YouTube. Do you remember those little parametric cones I told you to get earlier? Go ahead, pull one of those out because you're gonna wedge this somewhere in your kiln to stop that thing from tripping. Do you see that? Do you see that little nub right there? That thing right there needs to be blocked, and it's actually attached to the little wedge on the outside. Watch it move. My goal is to get my parametric cone and or bar and stick this right inside there to make sure that the kiln doesn't turn off. So here's what you're gonna do. Whenever I push this thing down, right here, this thing in here moves upwards. And the only reason this thing ever needs to be down is to hold this thing right here upwards, just like this. Since I can't stay here forever and ever and ever and ever while the kiln goes off, because number one, I got things to do, and number two, I'll probably burn my hand off. So I'm going to hold this upwards, and then I'm going to hold this downwards with one of my hands. Then with my other hand, I'm going to put this little parametric bar right in the middle right here and release the latch. And it should be resting just like that with the pointed side downwards. So the flat part's going to be upwards and the pointed side's going to be downwards. So it's gonna end up looking just like this, except for without all the broken old stuff around it. Don't worry about going too far. There's little brackets right there that keep the pyrometric bar and or cone from going way too far up that channel right there. So you can push it all the way back and it'll be just fine. Okay, now that we've set our kiln, it's time to load the first layer. Potter tip. This thing right here is actually an extra shelf I put at the very bottom of my kiln. Because if anything runs, it runs on that shelf. I can simply take the shelf out and go ahead and replace it at a later time. But if something ran at the very bottom of my kiln, it would directly touch my kiln. So this is kind of just a little trick that I use to put at the very bottom of my kiln, simply so that I have an extra layer of protection. Potter tip number 2. I find it really helpful to put my stilts down before I actually put all my pottery down, for the simple reason that now I can learn where I'm going to put my pottery beforehand. If these stilts right here are gone, and I decide to load the entire perimeter with pottery, it's gonna be a little difficult for me to put my stuff down. Like, I really want a stilt to go right here to balance out this trifecta, but I can't because something's already there. So to avoid that, I'll usually load in my stilts first. Okay, it's time to load the second layer, but before you do, make sure that nothing except for the very bottom of your clean bottom pieces are touching your kilns. None of this stuff that has glazed material on it can touch the walls, can touch the floors, can touch each other. This might look like they're touching each other, but there's in fact a little tiny space left in between each and every one of these. It's one of the major reasons you're supposed to wipe off the bottom of your pottery before you put it downwards. So before you load the second layer, please check to make sure that none of these are touching each other. Usually at this point, I would say I would come and find you if you don't do this, but honestly, you're gonna wake up with the kiln in the morning and you're gonna find like 2 teacups stuck together like Siamese twins, and you're just hurting yourself at that point. So I mean, you get what you get. Now before you load the second layer, it's really important to keep your fingers off of the parts where the pillars already are. So for example, if I'm holding the shelf just like this and there's a pillar right there, I'm not going to be holding one of these and lowering it downwards. My fingers are going to get crushed by that pillar. So it's a really good idea to make sure you position your hands probably at this position, and this position, and this position, but not those 3 positions right there. If you're unclear about the amount of clearance you have in between each and every stilt and pottery itself, you can always get a ruler, put it directly on top of it, just like this, and if any of this ruler hits the very top of any of your items right here, that's not a good clearance level. At this point you have 2 choices. You can, number 1, take out the pottery that doesn't meet the proper clearance level for the next level of shelf, or number 2, get these little tiny stilts right here and go straight cheat mode. Instead of putting them upwards like this, go ahead and put them sideways and put them directly on top of the other stilts. If you do this well enough, it'll buy you about 1 more inch of clearance space, which should be enough to clear everything in your kiln as long as the amount of clearance that you need is only about this much. Just like your ex-boyfriend. I officially declare this kiln loaded AF. Now what you're gonna do is you're gonna plug up all these peepholes right here. Yeah, get in there, girl. Close the kiln. And because I have a Model 181 manual Skutt kiln, that means I have to do it by knobs. So we're not candling this thing at all. We're just gonna put it on high, and we're gonna put it on high. It's a good idea to make sure this thing's still up each and every time you load a level, because you might have accidentally bumped it. But considering it's up, you're gonna push very gently, very hard, this button right here, and you're gonna hold it down until it presses inwards. Hold it for a couple seconds, and then release. You should hear some kind of sound coming from it. Sounds like electric bugs in there. And that's how you load a glaze fire kiln. Now that both of them are on high, and it's set, what you're gonna do is you're gonna go to sleep, come back in about 12 or 13 hours after you've prayed really hard to the kiln gods, and see if that little thing right there tripped offwards. Alright, it is now the next morning, and this thing should be down right here. Remember when you set it, it was up like this? Now, it should be like this. The fact that this thing is down means that your kiln turned off at the appropriate time. And that's wonderful, because that means the little kiln setter on the inside melted and turned the rest of the kiln off when it was supposed to. And depending on when this thing turned off, that means the kiln's been turned off and been free fall cooling down for quite some time. So I highly suggest you feel the kiln to see if it's hot first, but if it's not, go ahead and crack that thing open. Now if you open up one of the peepholes and you see this is molten red hot in there like Sauron's eye, just close it. Just close it and leave it to cool down a little bit more. Now if this handle right here is not hot but you still feel some heat coming from the kiln, it's probably a good idea to take a brick and crack it just like this until it becomes a little bit safer to open up, because this will let everything cool off. Also keep in mind, if you feel a little bit of heat up here, the lower you go in the kiln, the hotter it's gonna get because all the good heat's trapped at the bottom. So if you're cracking this open and you're like, man, that's a little bit hot right there, then guarantee it's gonna be way hotter down there. And once your kiln has cooled off, you can open it up completely. Aw yeah, look at that. That is some sexy goodness right there. A nice clean bottom, no drips on the shelf, some nice separation of color, and everything seems like it's completely done. Well, thank you guys very much for joining me today. I really hope that helps some of you guys fire off this Model 181 kiln, or if you've just never really fired a manual kiln, the rules are basically the same, and I hope that helps some of you dirty potters out there. If you want to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below. May your kilns burn hot, and I will see you dirty potters next week.